This means that if we're trying to get to the root causes of ecological degradation, we need to be asking ourselves, why are we behaving the way we are? That is, what causes us to misuse nature? That would be, to answer that question would be to get to the root causes of our environmental problems. Next, this line drawing work, that is distinguishing between the use and abuse of nature, it ought to be obvious just from having set it in front of us that it's a very important task. It's an essential task. We have to be able to distinguish between our changes of nature that seem okay, that involve the legitimate use, from those that seem abusive. It's an essential task. I would say also it is an extremely difficult task, vastly more difficult than we typically realize. And thirdly, I would say it is also very much a normative task, a normative meaning that when we draw this line, we're going to be drawing upon the full list of factors that would enter into our conversation about what's moral and what's immoral, what's wise and what's foolish, what's prudent and what's imprudent and so on. What we think is pleasing and displeasing. All of those would be categories of normative factors, and all of them need to be brought to bear in this. This is basically a normative inquiry, which is to say, importantly, that facts alone are not going to answer this question. There's no amount of facts that we can gather and say, gee, if you just study the facts, it will tell you whether we are using nature and abusing it. That is emphatically not true. The facts are just facts, and they don't mean anything until they are put into some sort of normative or interpretive framework. This means, importantly, that the work of science, we need to see the work of science, while it is vital to this process, it is not going to be alone enough. Because science really is essentially a descriptive enterprise. Science is all about going out and gathering facts and testing them and bringing them together. It is not about evaluating those facts in any normative sense. So we can't just call up the scientists and say, would you please come in and tell us whether we are misusing nature? It is a completely wrong question to ask of scientists. They can give you the raw factual information you will need, but what they don't have, what they can't supply, is the test for evaluating those facts. That has to come from someplace outside of science. I think that these alternative ideas that we are presenting, whether it's the rights of nature, whether it's a public trust, whether it's other ways of talking about a different orientation toward the idea that animals might have rights, for example, or they might be morally worthy, or that we have a duty to future generations. I think the reason that these ideas don't catch on well is that they don't really expose and critique the foundations of the modern worldview as I have presented it. They don't challenge the framework that we have today, the framework that is so embedded in our mind that everything we hear is categorized and filtered by it. It doesn't really stop and get people to understand that the way they think is framed by a particular worldview, and it doesn't invite them to critique this worldview and to consider making fundamental changes to it. It doesn't challenge this cult of objectivity. It is still there. It doesn't challenge the notion that the public realm ought to be limited to arguments based upon scientifically verified facts. It doesn't challenge this notion that humans are a special life form, which we take to be a metaphysical truth, even though we'd be hard-pressed to find some grounding for it. That we are possessed of individual rights, including rights to negative liberty, including rights to private property. Where is the grounding there? Well, there is no particular grounding for it other than social consensus, but we don't see that. That is, we somehow think that these elements of our worldview are firmly established in a way that these alternative ideas being put forth are not. What I want to say, what I need to emphasize, frankly, is that this modern worldview that I think needs to be called into question is not just embraced on the far right. It is embraced up and down the political spectrum, and it is almost as strong on the far left. That is to say, you look at people who are in the civil rights crusades, they want to talk about individual rights. They are as much prone to accept human exceptionalism. They are as prone to talk about people as autonomous individuals, to talk about their rights that are independent of any place or any context. The reality is this worldview is all the way up and down the political spectrum. And it's hard for environmentalists who want to present a different worldview to know where to go, to find a home on the political spectrum. There is no home. There is no home. The far left is frankly hardly any more receptive than the far right. It is all about individual rights, individual liberty. It's all about autonomy. In fact, obviously, as you know, many people don't think that we have a political spectrum. It's more sort of curved space where the far left and far right end up coming together, both of them with a strong sense of individual negative liberty. It's just that people on the right want to focus more on some types of activities that should be free, and people on the left want other types of activities that should be free. But the whole spectrum really is liberal individualism in different forms. And if that's the worldview that's problematic, then the environmental movement needs to back up and realize that everything out there is hostile. Now that's a disturbing proposition. But so where do you end up then, politically speaking? Well, I come back to where Aldo Leopold was. Step one, the land is a community. We are part of that community. That's a communitarian message. And we need to see that that is a message that does not fit well with liberal individualism. You've got individual autonomy over here, and you've got community on the other side. This is not basically what you call a moral difference. I would call it an ontological difference. Are we basically autonomous individuals, rights-bearing, free people? Or are we really creatures who are embedded in something larger and whose welfare is dependent upon the health of that something larger? I think the environmental movement has got to pick the other approach. We have got to start presenting a message that is vastly more communitarian, that talks about us being in it together. The common good rhetoric is fine, but common good cannot just mean the sum preferences of people as individuals. I mean, that's what economists would swoop in and say, we know all about the common good. We're the best ones to try to calculate it. Let's just get our public opinion surveys out there. Let's ask people as consumers how much they'd spend on X and Y. It is completely wrong. We need to be talking about what we share. We need to be talking about the communities in which we are embedded. Our happiness depends upon that. Our welfare depends upon it. The ecological functioning of the landscape. Our human social communities, I don't mean to be downplaying them. They are equally important, but our conference today is much more about the natural community. Environmentalism needs, frankly, to come up, I think, with much different rhetoric. Vastly more communitarian, vastly more focused on the common good. It needs to have a much clearer ability to articulate this line between the use and abuse of nature. That work of distinguishing between the use and abuse of nature is something that awaits us. We should have been doing it all along. It's not there. Aldo Leopold, this is in the 1940s, he urges his fellow conservationists. He said, we have got to come together and have a single overall goal for our work. It was dropped. It didn't get picked up. To this day, it hasn't been picked up. One of the signs, I think, that the environmental movement really is a liberal cause, unfortunately, is that we buy into this 1,000 points of light approach. If we just have 1,000 different groups doing 1,000 things and saying 1,000, somehow it's going to add up to something. It doesn't. You don't get heard. 1,000 people talking, that's called murmur. That's called noise. That's called noise. Nothing gets heard. There needs to be much more of a single message. I mean, my only hope, and I have written about this, thought it for many years, the only hope I see in our attempts to deal with environmental degradation is if essentially all of the top environmental groups got together and agreed upon a single rhetoric. Here is what we're about. We're starting a land health movement. It doesn't have to be exactly that phrase, but something like that. A land health crusade. Here's what health means. Here's why we got to promote it. Here are going to be the ways we measure it. Let's start issuing week by week, month by month reports on the overall condition of our land, overall land health. It needs to be a new way of talking about the human predicament. It needs to be presented overtly in moral terms. Lots of comments about that, and I certainly applaud the claim that we need more moral language, but we've got to make it legitimate in the public realm. Right now, it clashes with this cult of objectivity. Right now, we want science to do everything.